The power goes out at 11 at night. Nobody in that house knows it won't come back for 6 days. And right now, the most prepared person on that entire street is sitting completely alone. He has water, he has a generator, he has a pantry stocked for months, but he doesn't have a single person he trusts. And that is exactly what makes him the first one to die when things get truly bad. The immediate failure is not physical, it is social. Grid-down events do not just remove electricity, they remove the illusion that modern life is something you survive by yourself. Emergency planners have a term for what happens next: the collapse of ambient infrastructure. Ambient infrastructure is everything that quietly does work for you without you noticing it. Things like traffic lights, refrigeration, water pumps, and cellular data. When it disappears all at once, the people who assumed independence meant isolation are the ones who suffer first. Most preparedness content gets this backwards. It sells the fantasy of the fortified individual, stocked shelves, a locked door, and total self-reliance. That framing feels safe because it is simple, but real emergency management research tells a different story, one that rarely makes it into survival content because it does not sell tactical gear. The overlooked truth is that social connection is a supply chain. It moves information, labor, and resources faster than any stockpile you could build alone. And it does something a stockpile cannot do, which is adapt in real time to a changing situation. The clearest evidence for this comes from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami in Japan. Researchers who studied survival outcomes afterward found something that surprised even seasoned disaster analysts. Neighborhoods with strong pre-existing social ties, what sociologists call bonding social capital, had measurably better survival and recovery outcomes than wealthier neighborhoods with weaker community bonds. This was not a small effect. Areas where neighbors already knew each other, checked on elderly residents, and shared informal networks recovered faster and lost fewer people during the evacuation window. Physical preparedness mattered, but it was not the deciding factor. Trust was. The mechanism behind this is not mysterious once you break it down. In the first minutes and hours of a disaster, official emergency response is almost always too slow to reach everyone. Search and rescue teams, medical responders, and government coordination take time to mobilize, sometimes hours, sometimes days in the case of widespread infrastructure damage. In that gap, the only functioning response system is the informal one already built into a neighborhood. A neighbor who knows an elderly resident lives alone on the 3rd floor can check on them in minutes. A stranger cannot, because a stranger does not know that resident exists. This is the isolation paradox laid bare. The person who trusts no one and depends on no one has removed themselves from the only rescue system that can actually respond in time. This changes the entire calculation of what preparedness should look like, and it escalates the stakes for anyone treating this topic as a purely material problem. Stockpiling water and food is necessary, but it solves for scarcity, not for coordination. A lone individual with perfect supplies still cannot watch every entrance to a building, cannot treat a serious injury alone, cannot gather intelligence about what is happening 3 streets over, and cannot rotate sleep schedules for security during an extended crisis. Coordination requires other people, and other people require trust, and trust is not something you can build in the middle of an emergency. It has to already exist before the lights go out. That is the transition this entire framework is built around, and it leads directly into the next hidden mechanism, the practical architecture of building that trust quietly, without ever making anyone around you feel like they're being recruited into a survival plan. Here is the danger most preparedness-minded people walk directly into without realizing it. The moment you announce your intentions, you change how people perceive you. Openly telling neighbors you are stockpiling supplies or preparing for collapse can trigger exactly the kind of suspicion and social distancing that makes the isolation paradox worse, not better. Emergency behavioral researchers who study community resilience describe this as a signaling problem. If your preparedness signals distrust or extremism, it repels the very network you are trying to build. The hidden science here comes from social psychology, specifically the study of low-stakes reciprocal exchange, sometimes called the foot-in-the-door effect, combined with the norm of reciprocity. Small favors do something disproportionate to their size. When you borrow a ladder from a neighbor, or return a wandering dog, or help carry groceries up a flight of stairs, you are not just performing a kind gesture, you are opening what sociologists call a reciprocity loop, an unspoken exchange that both people track without consciously realizing it. Research on social exchange theory, going back decades, shows that humans keep a kind of informal ledger of favors given and received, and that ledger creates a mild but persistent sense of obligation. This obligation is not a burden, it is the foundation of every functioning community support system that has ever existed, long before formal government emergency response existed at all. This is why the most effective form of preparedness networking looks almost invisible from the outside. Knowing your neighbor's dog's name, knowing which house has a chainsaw, knowing who works irregular night shifts and would be home during a daytime emergency. These details accumulate slowly and naturally if you simply pay attention and engage like a normal, friendly neighbor. You do not need a clipboard. You do not need a meeting. You need consistency. A brief conversation at the mailbox twice a month builds more real trust over a year than a single dramatic gesture ever could, because trust is built on predictability, and predictability requires repetition over time. The evidence for this pattern shows up again and again in post-disaster interviews conducted by emergency management researchers. Survivors of hurricanes, wildfires, and ice storms across the United States consistently describe the same phenomenon. The people who helped them first were rarely official responders. They were neighbors who already had some baseline familiarity. Someone who noticed a car had not moved in 2 days. Someone who remembered an elderly resident used a specific medication and needed refrigeration for it. None of this required a formal plan. It required months or years of small, low-stakes interactions that most people would never even categorize as preparedness. The survival implication here is direct and unavoidable. If you are only starting to build these relationships after a disaster has already begun, you have already lost the advantage entirely. Trust cannot be manufactured under pressure. Studies on rapid trust formation in crisis settings show that acute stress actually makes people more suspicious of unfamiliar faces, not less, because cognitive load under threat narrows a person's tolerance for uncertainty. The stranger who shows up at your door during a blackout offering help is processed by your nervous system as a potential threat first, and a potential ally second, if at all. But a familiar face, someone your brain has already filed away as safe through repeated low-stakes contact, bypasses that suspicion almost entirely. This is not a moral argument about kindness. It is a hardwired feature of human threat assessment, and it means the investment in quiet trust building has to happen months or years before it is needed, not during the emergency itself. This escalates the entire framework into something with real strategic weight, which brings us to the next hidden layer, the actual mental mapping of a neighborhood's hidden capabilities, something almost nobody does deliberately, even though almost everybody could. Picture a single block of an ordinary American neighborhood during a prolonged infrastructure failure. No formal roster, no meeting, no group chat, and yet within that block exists an entire distributed emergency response system hiding in plain sight. One house has a retired nurse, another has a contractor with a full set of tools and a generator large enough to run a refrigerator. A third house has a family with 2 able-bodied teenagers and a pickup truck. A fourth has an elderly couple who will need checking on, medication monitoring, and possibly mobility assistance. None of this is classified information. It is simply information nobody bothers to consciously assemble, because modern life trains people to treat neighbors as background noise rather than as a resource network. Emergency management professionals who study community resilience call this kind of informal capability inventory asset mapping, and it is normally done formally by disaster response coordinators at the city or county level. But the exact same logic scales down to an individual resident with no formal authority at all. The overlooked principle here is that this mapping does not require documentation, spreadsheets, or written notes, and in fact, writing it down can be counterproductive, since a written list of who has what supplies or skills becomes a liability if it falls into the wrong hands during a crisis, when scarcity can make even good people desperate. The real skill is holding this information mentally, updating it casually through ordinary conversation, and never treating it as a secret project. This is where quiet observation becomes a survival skill in its own right. Noticing that a neighbor mentioned a medical background in passing conversation. Noticing that another neighbor complained about hauling firewood, meaning they likely have a wood stove and heating capacity independent of the electric grid. Noticing which houses have visible solar panels, which have backup generators wired into their homes, which have wells instead of relying entirely on municipal water. None of this requires investigation. It requires attention, the same low-effort attention a good neighbor naturally pays to the people around them. The historical evidence for why this mental mapping matters comes from mutual aid research conducted after major American disasters, including Hurricane Katrina and various regional ice storms across the Midwest and Northeast. Analysts studying these events found that neighborhoods able to self-organize fastest were the ones where residents already had an informal understanding of who could do what. Communities without this understanding lost critical time in the first 72 hours simply figuring out who among them had medical training, tools, or mobility. Precious hours that in a true emergency can determine whether someone survives a treatable injury or not. The survival implication scales with the size of the emergency. In a short-term power outage lasting a day or two, informal mapping barely matters, since everyone can simply wait it out. But in an extended grid-down scenario, the kind caused by severe winter storms, major hurricanes, or significant infrastructure failures lasting a week or more, this informal knowledge becomes the actual operating system of neighborhood survival. It determines who gets medical attention first, who checks on isolated elderly residents, who can repair a broken water line, and who has the fuel or equipment to keep essential systems running. This is not paranoid thinking. This is simply how functioning communities have always operated during crises, long before anyone called it preparedness at all. And it sets up the final and most important mechanism in this entire framework, the one that turns individual relationships into an actual mutual aid and support system. Every quiet favor exchanged over months or years accumulates into something economists and sociologists both recognize as social capital. But in a crisis, that capital converts into something much more immediate, a functioning mutual aid pact that nobody ever formally agreed to. This is the reciprocity loop reaching its final stage, and understanding it changes how you should think about every small interaction with the people around you. When you help a neighbor move a heavy piece of furniture, or lend a tool, or simply show up consistently as a reliable, friendly presence, you are not performing isolated acts of kindness. You are making small deposits into a relationship that, under pressure, behaves like an insurance policy neither party ever had to sign. Behavioral economists who study reciprocity describe this as the difference between transactional exchange and relational exchange. A transactional exchange is a one-time trade, equal value for equal value, settled immediately. A relational exchange is open-ended, unequal in the short term, and settled over an extended and often undefined period of time. Grid-down survival almost always depends on relational exchange because emergencies rarely distribute burdens evenly. One household might have medical skills but no fuel. Another might have fuel but no security capability at night. The third might have neither but has 3 extra sets of hands for physical labor. None of these households can survive optimally alone, but together, bound by the informal debts and credits built through years of ordinary neighborliness, they form something closer to an actual defense and support network, one built entirely on trust rather than formal contracts. The evidence for how powerful this becomes under real stress comes from mutual aid organizing that spontaneously formed during the 2020 pandemic across cities throughout the United States. Researchers studying these grassroots networks found that the fastest, most effective local support systems were almost always built on pre-existing relationships, not formal charity structures. Neighbors who already had some baseline familiarity organized grocery runs, medication pickups, and check-in systems for isolated or vulnerable residents within days, while formal institutional responses were still being organized weeks later. The pattern is consistent across nearly every documented American disaster response, from wildfires in California to ice storms in Texas. Informal trust networks move faster than formal systems every single time because they do not require permission, paperwork, or bureaucratic approval to activate. This is the final escalation, and it carries genuine philosophical weight beyond survival tactics alone. The uncomfortable truth buried underneath all of this is that modern life has quietly stripped away the informal social infrastructure humans depended on for the vast majority of our history. For most of human existence, community interdependence was not optional. It was the only system available, and it worked because it had to work. Modern convenience removed the necessity, and without the necessity, most people let the relationships atrophy, right up until the moment those relationships become the only thing standing between order and chaos. The people who quietly rebuild that invisible network before it is needed are not being paranoid. They are simply restoring something almost every generation before ours understood by default. And the people who wait until the lights go out to start building it will find, often too late, that trust cannot be manufactured under pressure. It has to already be there, waiting quietly, long before anyone ever needed to use it.